Okay, listener name. You sent us some excerpts from this book, Debunking Swami Vivekananda, A Christian Response. And this looks like it gets right into some pretty heavy stuff. You're clearly interested in Vivekananda, but specifically how his life and teachings kind of bump up against Christian beliefs.
And what's fascinating about this book is it really takes a direct approach. It doesn't just scratch the surface. It really digs deep into his philosophy and legacy, looking for inconsistencies, contradictions, especially when you're coming at it from a Christian perspective.
You've sent us excerpts covering a lot of ground.
A lot.
A huge amount. I mean, his rise to fame in 19th century India, his whole philosophical foundation, his interpretation of Jesus, even allegations of cultural appropriation. I mean, where do we even begin with all this?
Well, the book starts by taking a look at that narrative surrounding his rise to fame, kind of picking apart this image of him as like a spiritual luminary.
Okay, so chapter 1. The Rise of Swami Vivekananda, Myth and Reality. What did you find most intriguing there?
The book acknowledges that he was very charismatic and that his speech at the 1893 World Parliament of Religions, really had an impact. But it also points out that there were already some controversies even during his lifetime.
Controversies?
Yeah.
Like, spill the tea.
So even back then, people were questioning if his actions actually matched his words.
So maybe not quite the flawless unifier, as he's sometimes made out to be. What about his core teachings? What does the book say about that?
Well, the next few chapters really get into the nitty-gritty of Advaita Vedanta, that idea that ultimately everything is one. Your individual soul, Atman, is identical to the universal consciousness, Brahman. This concept is super central to understanding his whole worldview.
And it seems to resonate with people all over the place, India, the West. But the book doesn't just take that at face value, right?
Right. It really scrutinizes how he applies this Advaita Vedanta, especially when it comes to social issues and gender roles. And listener name, if you're someone who thinks about how spiritual beliefs actually translate into action in the real world, this part might really speak to you.
So you're saying this idea of oneness, when you try to put it into practice, maybe doesn't quite live up to its own ideals.
Yeah, that's a key point of contention. And it plays out in other areas, too, like how he interprets Jesus.
And there's a whole chapter on that. What's the main critique there?
They argue that he kind of presented a version of Jesus that made sense to Hindus but didn't actually align with core Christian beliefs about things like Christ's divinity and the whole idea of salvation. It's like he tried to force Jesus into a Hindu framework instead of really engaging with Christianity on its own terms.
So taking bits and pieces, but not the whole picture.
Yeah.
And that leads into that whole accusation of cultural appropriation, right?
Exactly. The book digs into how, in trying to make Hinduism palatable to the West, he might have stripped away some of the original meaning and context, presented a simplified, almost exoticized version.
And it really makes you wonder, was he genuinely trying to build a bridge between cultures, or was it more about promoting his own worldview?
Yeah, and that question becomes even more pressing when you look at his whole thing about universalism and pluralism.
But isn't he often praised for promoting tolerance between religions? What's the problem there?
Well, the book says his idea of levels of truth, with Advaita Vedanta at the top, actually creates a spiritual hierarchy. And that kind of goes against true pluralism. It's like saying all religions are true, but mine is truer.
So it's not a level playing field. There's this ranking system where one tradition is ultimately seen as better.
Right.
Listener name, if you're someone who's into interfaith dialogue, that's something to really think about. Can you really have a true dialogue if one side believes they've already got the highest truth?
Right, exactly. And it gets even trickier because the book connects this hierarchy to, the caste system. So it kind of reinforces that idea of spiritual elitism.
Whoa, okay. So we're not just talking about abstract ideas here, but how those ideas might actually be perpetuating real-world inequalities.
Yeah.
That's heavy stuff. So we've got this critique of his universalism, but the book also challenges his whole vision for social reform, right?
Exactly. They say his focus on individual transformation didn't really do enough to tackle big systemic issues like caste and patriarchy. It's like they say you can't just meditate your way out of oppression.
So he's calling for this spiritual awakening, but not really dealing with the need for broader social change. Kind of a disconnect there. Like he was saying, if you reach enlightenment, the outside world doesn't matter as much. But for people who are actually experiencing oppression, that's just not true.
Right. And the book also brings up how there are some factual errors, scientific inaccuracies, and anachronisms in his teachings.
Wait, so he got stuff wrong?
In some instances, yeah. For example, his interpretations of ancient Indian history, according to the book, are often romanticized and inaccurate.
Wow. Okay. So not just his philosophy, but also his grasp of history is being challenged.
And then there's the whole thing about his attempts to reconcile Hindu philosophy with modern science. The book claims he often made, strained interpretations and pseudoscientific claims,
Mm.
basically trying to force fit ancient ideas into a modern scientific framework. Listener name, if you're someone who values both science and spirituality, this might be a red flag.
Trying to blend those two is tricky.
Yeah.
It sounds like he was more interested in defending his own views than being accurate about science or history.
That's one interpretation. And then it leads to this even deeper level where the book picks apart the logical errors in his philosophy.
Okay, let's unpack that. What kind of errors are we talking about here?
Contradictions, non sequiturs, fallacies. Things that weaken the arguments. Like, for instance, his claim about the inherent divinity of all beings. The book says that's based on metaphysical assumptions, not sound reasoning.
So big claims, but not much solid evidence to back them up.
Yeah, it's a problem if you're trying to make a coherent philosophy. And it goes even further, accusing him of circular reasoning, where he kind of uses his conclusions as proof for his arguments.
So it's like he's saying, I'm right because I said so.
Pretty much.
Not very convincing. And the book also points out how he relies a lot on appeals to authority, like ancient texts or revered figures, but he doesn't really subject those authorities to critical examination.
Right. It's like saying, believe me because these ancient texts say so, but without acknowledging that those texts might have their own issues or limitations.
Makes sense.
And then the whole monism idea that everything is one, the book argues that that's actually got some cognitive biases woven in.
Well, that's interesting. We haven't touched on cognitive biases yet. What did they find?
Well, for instance, they think he might have been prone to confirmation bias. So basically focusing on information that already supported his beliefs and ignoring the stuff that contradicted it.
So he's filtering everything through his own lens
Yeah.
instead of looking at it objectively.
Pretty much.
Any other biases?
Yeah, they also think there might be some in-group bias going on where he favors his own Hindu tradition and kind of downplays other perspectives.
It's like a pattern is emerging here. Not just logical inconsistencies, but also these potential biases that are shaping his entire framework.
Right.
Makes you wonder how much is solid reasoning and how much is influenced by these unconscious biases.
And according to the book, these biases have consequences. They say these biases led him to epistemological errors, mistakes in how he acquired and justified his knowledge.
Okay, give us an example. What kind of errors?
Like relying too much on metaphysical speculation without any real-world evidence. He makes these big claims about the nature of reality, but the book says he doesn't back them up with actual observations or logical proof. It's like building a house without a foundation.
That's not going to be a very stable house.
Nope. They also criticize how much he relies on appeals to authority, like scriptures or sages, but without really questioning if those authorities are even valid in the first place.
Blind trust without critical thinking.
Right. And then there's the over-reliance on subjective experience.
Yeah. He talks a lot about spiritual experiences, which can be very powerful.
Yeah.
But are they really a good basis for universal truths?
That's the problem. The book says he doesn't really account for the fact that experiences can be totally subjective and open to interpretation. It's like saying, because I felt it, it must be true for everyone. But we all know personal experiences can be influenced by so many things.
So we've seen how the book critiques his reliance on authority, subjective experience, and flawed logic. But they go even further, right? They actually say that when you test his whole monism thing for consistency, it starts to fall apart.
Yeah, they're basically looking for those internal contradictions, and they find a lot of them.
Okay, give us the juicy details. What kind of contradictions?
For example, the tension between his claim that all religions are one and his simultaneous assertion that Hinduism is, superior. It's like saying all paths lead to the same destination, but mine is the best one.
Definitely sounds contradictory. Listener name, are you starting to see how these inconsistencies kind of unravel his whole system?
Another thing is the contradiction between his calls for universal brotherhood and his occasional denigration of other religions.
Right.
Sometimes he uses terms like barbaric or primitive, which kind of clashes with that whole inclusivity message.
So there's a disconnect between his ideal vision of unity and the way he actually talks about other faiths sometimes. It's like he can't quite reconcile his belief in the oneness of all religions with this sense of Hindu superiority.
Yeah, and that tension runs through a lot of his arguments. Like, he says all religions are valid, but then criticizes the dogma and rigidity of certain traditions, advocates for religious unity, but then asserts a strong Hindu identity.
So trying to have it both ways.
Yeah.
And the book says that this lack of coherence ultimately weakens his whole philosophical framework.
Exactly. It's like he's building a bridge between East and West, but the foundations are shaky on both sides.
Okay, so those are the internal contradictions.
Yeah.
But the book also points out the external ones, right? How his ideas clash with reality.
Absolutely. Like, for example, they challenge his romanticized view of Hinduism as inherently tolerant and inclusive, saying it ignores all the historical instances of conflict and even persecution.
So he's giving us this idealized version that doesn't match up with history.
Right, kind of airbrushing out the not-so-great parts.
Are there other external contradictions?
Yeah, they question his claim that all religions lead to the same truth, pointing out that there are some real differences between belief systems.
Yeah.
And those differences can have real-world consequences. They also criticize him for not addressing the caste system adequately.
So he's preaching about this universal brotherhood, but he's not acknowledging the systems of oppression that actually divide people.
Yeah. And they point out that his assertion of Hinduism's superiority contradicts the reality of how diverse religions are around the globe. You know, each tradition has its own unique values and insights, and to claim that one is better than the others just isn't accurate.
Right.
And finally, the book argues that this message of religious tolerance and harmony doesn't quite match up with what we're seeing in the world today with rising extremism and violence. It's a nice vision, but it doesn't account for the forces of division and conflict.
So inspiring, but maybe not very practical in the real world.
Yeah, that's a major critique. And it all leads back to the book's main argument that while Vivekananda was influential, his teachings need to be looked at critically.
Yeah. And they go even further, right? They really analyze the problems with his concept of a spiritual hierarchy.
Exactly. That's a core issue for them. They say this hierarchy, where Adventists are at the top, is elitist and basically reinforces the caste system.
So it's not just some abstract idea, but something that can have real social consequences.
Right. And they connect it to the whole problem of spiritual imperialism.
Spiritual imperialism. What's that?
It's like saying, my way is the highest way, and everyone else needs to recognize that. That's the heart of their critique. And they say that this approach basically shuts down any real interfaith dialogue and understanding.
Because you're not treating different faiths as equals. You're creating a power dynamic where one is seen as inherently better.
Exactly. And the book argues that this kind of hierarchy, whether it's intentional or not, ultimately undermines the very pluralism and tolerance that Vivekananda claimed to be all about.
Okay, wow. We have covered a lot here. We've seen how the book looks at his rise to fame, picks apart his philosophy, analyzes his Jesus interpretation, and exposes all these potential biases, errors, and inaccuracies. And it ties all that to this bigger critique of spiritual elitism and imperialism. That's a pretty intense assessment.
It is, and I think it's important for anyone who wants to understand interfaith dialogue and the complexities of religious thought.
Absolutely. Because while his message of unity and tolerance might sound nice, the book is saying there's a lot more going on beneath the surface that needs to be carefully examined.
And it reminds us that even figures who are praised for their spirituality and wisdom can have beliefs that are ultimately harmful or misleading.
So listener name, as you continue to explore Vivekananda's teachings, remember these critiques. Don't be afraid to question his assumptions, analyze his arguments, and compare them to what you understand about truth and spirituality.
Critical thinking isn't about disrespecting traditions or people. It's about engaging with ideas thoughtfully and carefully. That's how we grow.
Well said. So we've covered a ton already, but there's still more to go.
Yeah, let's look at some specific chapters and really get into the details.
Sounds good. We'll pick up where we left off in part 2.
Now let's get into a chapter that I think really cuts to the core of what the book is trying to say. Debunking levels of truth. This is where they tackle his whole concept of universalism head-on, and listener name, it raises some big questions about whether his vision of unity actually lines up with Christian beliefs.
Okay, remind me what the book's issue is with universalism. I mean, on the surface, embracing all faiths, finding that common ground. Sounds like a good thing, right?
Yeah, it sounds good, but the book says the problem is that it ends up being more hierarchical than pluralistic.
Okay.
He puts Advaita Vedanta right at the top and claims it's the most complete or realized truth. So instead of this true equality between religions, You've got this ranking system where one tradition is inherently superior.
Right, that whole levels of truth idea. So instead of mutual respect between different traditions, you've got one that's considered inherently superior.
Exactly. And the book doesn't shy away from connecting this to actual social structures, which, listener name, if you're interested in spirituality and social justice, this part is really relevant.
They're explicitly linking this spiritual hierarchy to the caste system.
Yep, and there's a whole chapter on that, the caste logic of spiritual elitism, basically saying his hierarchy reinforces the idea that some people are just inherently more spiritually capable than others, much like how the caste system assigns social status based on birth.
So instead of promoting equality, this spiritual hierarchy might actually be propping up spiritual privilege.
That's their critique.
Yeah.
And it goes even further, connecting it to this concept they call spiritual imperialism.
Spiritual imperialism. Okay, that sounds intense. Break that down for me.
Basically, it's this idea that by saying Advaita Vedanta is the highest truth, he's imposing his worldview on others, especially Western traditions. It's like saying my spiritual path is the ultimate one and yours needs to be measured against it.
So it's a subtle form of spiritual colonialism, where one tradition dominates the others. And the book says that this directly goes against the pluralism and tolerance he claimed to be all about.
Exactly. And listener name, this is a big question for anyone interested in interfaith dialogue. Can you really have true dialogue if one side thinks their tradition is better than everyone else's?
Interesting. So we've seen how the book really dismantles his universalism, linking it to spiritual elitism, social hierarchy, even imperialism, but the critique goes deeper than that, right? Remember how we talked about those factual errors and logical fallacies they point out in his work?
Right.
They tie all that back to a deeper critique of his methodology, his whole way of knowing and justifying his beliefs.
Exactly. Like how he relied so much on intuition, mystical experiences, appeals to authority, but without really examining them critically.
And as we said, those can be really unreliable sources of knowledge, especially if you're not scrutinizing them carefully.
Right. And the book also brings up those cognitive biases again, confirmation bias, in-group bias, self-serving bias, and how those could have further skewed his thinking.
It's like this chain reaction, isn't it? Faulty methodology plus cognitive biases equals those factual errors and logical fallacies, which leads to a flawed worldview.
Exactly. And it's a pretty powerful critique because it makes you question the whole foundation of his teachings.
It's one thing to point out the philosophical problems, but the book doesn't stop there. They explicitly say that this flawed way of knowing led him to overlook systemic injustices when it came to social reform.
Yeah, they basically say that his focus on individual transformation kind of blinded him to the need for bigger societal change. It's like he was saying that if everyone just achieved enlightenment, all the social problems would just vanish.
Right?
But we know that's not how it works. Real change needs us to tackle systemic issues head on.
So it's not just an abstract debate, it's a direct challenge to the practical implications of his teachings.
Exactly. And this critique goes even further when they look at how he interpreted Jesus.
Ah, yes. That whole chapter on debunking his portrayal of Christ. What are the main issues there?
Well, they say that he basically presented this very selective and distorted version of Jesus that fit into his own philosophy but didn't align with what Christians actually believe. He downplayed Christ's divinity, twisted the teachings on salvation, and pretty much stripped away what makes Jesus' message unique. It's like he was trying to squeeze Jesus into this Hindu box instead of actually engaging with Christianity.
So less about genuine interfaith understanding and more about trying to absorb Christianity into his own worldview.
That's a good way to put it. And it goes back to that spiritual imperialism idea. It's not about respecting the other tradition. It's about assimilating it.
And this ultimately blocks real dialogue and understanding between faiths.
Exactly. Because it's not about mutual respect or learning from each other. It's about control and dominance.
Wow. Okay. So we've covered a lot. From the problems with his universalism to the critiques of how he knows things and how he interprets Jesus. It's a pretty harsh assessment.
It is. But the book doesn't just tear things down. It also offers this alternative vision based on Christian principles.
Right. They present a Christian response to that whole issue of spiritual elitism and imperialism. What does that look like?
It stresses the radical inclusivity of the gospel, where salvation and spiritual empowerment are open to everyone, no matter their background or social status. That's very different from Vivekananda's hierarchical view, where spiritual attainment is all about your intellect and social position.
So you don't have to reach a certain level of enlightenment or belong to a certain group to be worthy of God's grace.
Exactly. It also talks about the Holy Spirit as a source of empowerment, accessible to anyone who wants a relationship with God. So instead of relying on these complex systems or techniques, it's about a direct connection with the divine.
Sounds a lot more straightforward and empowering. What else does this Christian vision emphasize?
It emphasizes the Christian call to challenge injustice and oppression, not just through personal transformation, but through collective action and social reform. So it's not just about meditating your way to a better world, it's about actively working to change those structures of inequality.
Putting faith into action.
Right. And it really focuses on the power of love and compassion, not just as concepts, but as real lived experiences that can heal and bring people together.
That's powerful. And it seems like it's exactly what's needed to counter that spiritual elitism and imperialism that the book is criticizing.
It is. And it reminds us that true spirituality isn't about being elite or dominating others. It's about humility, service, and love.
Okay, we've really dug deep into this book, exploring the critiques and the alternative vision.
And what's really fascinating is how it all comes together in the last chapter.
The conclusion, where they talk about Vivekananda's legacy as both a successful defender of Hinduism and a failed missionary.
Yeah, it's like he was brilliant at critiquing the West and promoting Hinduism in India, but his attempts to spread it to the West didn't really work.
That's an interesting paradox.
Yeah.
What does the book say about why he might have failed as a missionary?
They give a few reasons. First, they say his monistic philosophy was maybe too abstract and hard for Westerners to understand. Talking about the unity of everything in theory is one thing, but actually experiencing it, especially if you're from a different culture, is a whole other ballgame.
It's a huge shift in perspective.
Exactly. They also suggest that his approach to Christianity, which was sometimes confrontational, could have turned people off. He was great at pointing out the problems of the West, but that's not always the best way to win people over.
You catch more flies with honey than vinegar, right?
Exactly. And finally, they say that he didn't really establish strong institutions or organizational structures in the West. So the impact of his teachings was limited. Like, he was a brilliant speaker and thinker, but not so much a builder or organizer.
So it's not just what you say, it's how you say it and how you set things up for the long term.
Right. And the book says this is an important lesson to learn from his mixed legacy. Listener name, if you're into interfaith dialogue or spreading spiritual ideas, you've got to pay attention to both the message and the methods. And don't be afraid to question even those who are seen as great spiritual leaders.
Critical thinking is key, especially when it comes to faith and spirituality.
Absolutely. And that leads to another really interesting point in the conclusion. They talk about how you can also look at Vivekananda's work through a caste-based lens.
Oh, interesting. How does caste fit into this?
Well, they say that because he came from a high caste background, he was particularly worried about lower caste Hindus converting to Christianity. So it wasn't just about defending Hinduism in general, but also about maintaining the power of the upper castes.
So he was protecting the interests of the upper castes.
Right. And they say that his emphasis on Hinduism being superior could have been a way of keeping that social hierarchy in place.
Like he was saying, converting to Christianity isn't just about changing religions. It's about betraying your culture and your caste.
Exactly. And that kind of rhetoric has been used to justify oppression and maintain control for a long time.
So while he presented himself as a unifier, the book argues his motives might have been tied to preserving the existing power structure.
Exactly. And they connect this to the rise of Hindutva ideology and how nationalist groups have used his legacy for their own purposes.
Taking his words and twisting them to promote a much narrower, less tolerant version of Hinduism.
Right. And that's why critical thinking is so crucial, listener name. Don't just take things at face value. Dig deeper. Look at the historical and social context.
Because there might be hidden agendas behind all those grand pronouncements and inspiring words.
Exactly. By understanding those, we can better navigate the complexities of religion and interfaith relations.
Okay, wow, we've really been through a lot in this deep dive. We've looked at the book's critiques of his life, his teachings, his legacy, even that famous speech of his. It's been a wild ride.
It has. And I think it raises some important questions for anyone interested in Hinduism, Christianity, interfaith dialogue, or just the complexity of religious thought.
For sure. The book really pushes us to look at Vivekananda's ideas with a critical eye, to not just accept what he says, but to really think it through, question it, and see how it fits with our own understanding of truth.
And to be aware of the potential for things like spiritual elitism, imperialism, and the misuse of religious authority.
So listener name, as you keep exploring these topics, remember these insights. Don't be afraid to ask tough questions and really search for the truth.
Because finding the truth requires us to be both open-minded and discerning.
Well said. Okay, that wraps up this part of our deep dive into the world of Swami Vivekananda.
What's fascinating is how it all comes together in the last chapter.
The conclusion, right, where they talk about Vivekananda's legacy as both a successful defender of Hinduism and a failed missionary.
Precisely. And I think this duality perfectly captures the complex and often contradictory nature of his impact. It's like he was brilliant at critiquing the West and rallying support for Hinduism within India, but his attempts to spread Hindu teachings abroad didn't really take root.
It's an interesting paradox. What insights does the book offer into why he might have failed as a missionary?
They point out a few key reasons. Firstly, they suggest his monistic philosophy might have been too abstract and difficult for Western audiences to grasp. It's one thing to talk about the unity of all existence in a theoretical sense, but quite another to translate that into a lived experience for someone raised in a completely different cultural context.
That makes sense. It's like trying to explain the concept of oneness to someone who's been taught to see the world in terms of duality and separation. It's a huge paradigm shift.
Exactly. And they also suggest that his confrontational approach towards Christianity might have alienated potential converts. He was very good at pointing out the flaws and hypocrisies of the West, but that doesn't necessarily win you friends or influence people.
It's like that saying, you can catch more flies with honey than with vinegar.
Precisely. And finally, they point out that his reluctance to establish strong institutions or organizational structures in the West limited the long-term impact of his teachings. It's like he was a brilliant speaker and thinker, but not necessarily a great organizer or institution builder.
So it's not just about the message, but about the methods and structures used to spread it.
Exactly. And the book argues that this is a key lesson to learn from Vivekananda's mixed legacy. Listener name. If you're interested in interfaith dialogue or the spread of spiritual ideas, it's crucial to pay attention to both the message and the methods. And don't be afraid to question even those who are celebrated as great spiritual leaders.
Critical thinking is essential, even perhaps especially when dealing with matters of faith and spirituality.
And that brings us to a fascinating observation in the book's conclusion. They point out that Vivekananda's activities should also be seen through a caste-based lens.
Okay, unpack that for us. How does caste play into this?
They argue that Vivekananda, coming from a high caste background, was particularly concerned with preventing lower caste Hindus from converting to Christianity. So it wasn't just about defending Hinduism in general, but about protecting the interests of the upper castes.
So it wasn't just about defending Hinduism in general, but about protecting the interests of the upper castes.
That's a key point. And they suggest that his emphasis on the superiority of Hinduism might have been a way of maintaining the social hierarchy.
It's like he was saying, if you convert to Christianity, you're not just changing your religion, you're betraying your culture and your caste.
And they point out that this kind of rhetoric has been used throughout history to justify oppression and maintain social control.
So while Vivekananda might have presented himself as a champion of Hindu pride and unity, the book argues that his motives were more complex and potentially tied to preserving the existing power structure.
Exactly, and they make a direct connection to the rise of Hindutva ideology and the way Vivekananda's legacy has been co-opted by nationalist groups.
It's like they're using his image in his words to promote a narrow and exclusionary version of Hinduism that's very different from the inclusive and tolerant vision he sometimes espoused.
And that's why critical thinking is so important, listener name. Don't just accept interpretations at face value. Dig deeper, question assumptions, and consider the historical and social contexts.
Because behind the grand pronouncements and inspiring rhetoric, there might be hidden agendas and power dynamics at play.
Exactly. And by understanding those dynamics, we can better navigate the complexities of religious thought and interfaith relations.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. It's been quite the intellectual journey. We've explored the book's critiques of Vivekananda's life, teachings, legacy, and even his most famous speech.
It's been a whirlwind, but there's still one more piece of this puzzle we need to examine. The book's analysis of Vivekananda's first speech at the 1893 World Parliament of Religions.
Ah, yes, the speech that launched him onto the global stage. It's fascinating to see how the book deconstructs that speech, revealing the hidden contradictions and biases within it.
Sounds intriguing. We'll delve into that in part 3. Okay, so let's talk about that famous speech at the World Parliament of Religions, the one in 1893, the one that everyone always talks about.
Right, the one that basically made him a global figure. But the book says that even this speech, this really famous speech, isn't what it seems.
Exactly. They actually dedicate a whole chapter to like taking it apart and showing all the contradictions and factual errors and, even logical fallacies that are kind of hidden under this eloquent language. Listener name, if you're interested in how people use rhetoric, this is a really good example.
Okay, let's get into the nitty-gritty of this speech. Where do they even start?
Well, they start by setting the scene. Remember, this is 1893. Colonialism is at its peak. Christian missionaries are all over the world trying to convert people.
Right, so a lot of power dynamics at play, even though it's this gathering of different faiths.
Exactly. And the book says you can't understand the speech without understanding that context. It wasn't just some neutral philosophy talk. It was part of this bigger cultural and political struggle.
So there was more to it than meets the eye.
That's what they're saying. And they back it up by going through all the main points.
Give me some examples. What did they find?
Okay, well, one thing is they take issue with his claim that Hinduism is the mother of all religions. They say it's not historically accurate and that it ignores how other faiths developed on their own.
So not just an exaggeration, but something that puts Hinduism at the top of this hierarchy.
Right, which fits with the book's critique of him being a spiritual elitist.
Yeah, makes sense. And they also question how he portrays Hinduism as inherently tolerant and accepting. Like, he's ignoring all the times when there was intolerance and discrimination within Hindu history.
Right. It's that idealized version of Hinduism we keep seeing.
What else?
They also criticize how he really emphasizes Advaita Vedanta, making it seem like it's the way to understand Hinduism.
Ignoring all the other schools of thought and practices within Hinduism.
Yeah, picking and choosing to fit his narrative. And he does this with other religions, too. He talks about universal brotherhood, but then makes some pretty negative comments about certain traditions.
Yeah, calling them barbaric and primitive, which doesn't really sound very tolerant.
And the book points that out. It contradicts his message of inclusivity and shows that there's this underlying bias.
Okay, so we've got the factual errors, the selective interpretations, and this subtle message of Hindu superiority. But the book also looks at his logic.
Oh, yeah. They find a bunch of logical fallacies that weaken his whole argument.
Like what?
One is non sequiturs, where his conclusions don't follow from what he's saying. Like he says Hinduism is superior because it's old.
But that doesn't mean it's true, right?
Yeah.
Just because something's old doesn't make it better.
Exactly. They also point out how he uses false dilemmas, giving you only two choices and making his seem like the only good one. It's a way to oversimplify things and force people to agree with him.
That's a classic debate tactic. Make it seem like there's no other option.
Right. Not very honest. And they go even deeper, talking about the epistemological errors in the speech. So, the mistakes he makes in how he figures out what's true.
Remind me about epistemology again. It's about how we know what we know.
Right. And the book says he makes some big mistakes in this area.
Like what?
Well, one thing is epistemic relativism, the idea that truth is different for everyone and every culture. It sounds open-minded, but it makes it impossible to say if any belief is actually right or wrong.
So everyone's truth is equally valid, even if they clash.
Exactly. And they also say he relies too much on personal experience and mystical stuff as proof.
Right. Those can be powerful, but they're not always reliable.
Right. They're subjective. And then there's the appeals to authority again, quoting ancient texts and wise figures without questioning them.
That blind trust.
Yeah. And all this is made worse by those cognitive biases, confirmation bias, in-group bias, self-serving bias, distorting his thinking.
So it's like this whole recipe for a speech that's more about convincing people than about truth.
That's exactly it. And it shows us that even speeches that sound really tolerant and well-spoken can have a lot of problems.
So listener name, when you're listening to speeches, remember these critiques. Don't be fooled by charisma or fancy words. Look at the logic, the evidence, the potential biases.
Critical thinking is so important, especially when it comes to faith and spirituality.
Okay, we have covered SOMUCH in this deep dive. We've gone through the book's analysis of his life, his teachings, what he left behind, and even his most famous speech. What a journey.
It has been, and it brings up some big questions for anyone interested in these topics. Hinduism, Christianity, how different faiths relate to each other, the whole idea of religious thought.
Absolutely. The book is really pushing us to look at Vivekananda's ideas critically, to not just take his word for it, but to really dig in and see how it all fits together.
And to watch out for things like spiritual elitism and imperialism, the misuse of authority.
So listener name, as you continue exploring these topics, remember what we've talked about today. Don't be afraid to question things and search for the truth.
Because the truth is out there, but it takes effort and discernment to find it.
Well said. Okay, folks, that's it for our deep dive into the world of Swami Vivekananda. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.